Hey, welcome to, I believe I'm on video 25 of the King James only series that I'm doing. And again, I'm returning to Mr. Melton's book, Fighting Back booklet. And this next section that I want to address here is on page 8, and it's titled Antioch versus Alexandria. And he says this statement: "It is a well-established fact that there are only two lines of Bibles, one coming from Antioch and one coming from Alexandria. The Antioch is the majority text from which our King James 1611 comes, and the Egyptian text is the minority text from which the new perversions come." I want to share with you, I have a new resource. I use a Bible software program called Logos Bible Software version 4, and matter of fact, the sticker you see in the background there, the blue, white, that's kind of their logo. Anyway, they sent me some stickers, and I put one there. But I got a new resource in here, and it's called A Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament, 2nd edition, and it's by Bruce Metzger. And I want to share with you some of the things. He basically, for the sake of time, because this is my second time making this video, the first one was 15 minutes long, so I'm having to redo it and kind of shorten down some things. Plus, you don't want to hear me reading a bunch of stuff anyway. But there's 4 types or families of manuscripts. Okay. Now here he uses the word Bibles, 2 lines of Bibles, and that's not really technically correct. What it is there's 4 families of manuscripts, not Bibles, but Greek manuscripts. And what happened basically is when these things were being hand copied, because as Christianity spread, people were wanting, the words of God. I mean, because these letters, the epistles by Paul, they were being sent out to churches and being read, and then, they started spreading. So people wanted their own copy of it, so they would either have it professionally copied or they would copy it themselves by hand so they could have their own. And what would happen is as it spread to these different areas, a lot of factors would impact kind of the way that it was copied. And so what happened is, over time, as you get more and more of these manuscripts produced, they would start kind of having similar characteristics in certain areas. Anyway, but the 4 families here, Mr. Milton says there's only 2, Antioch and Alexandrian. There's actually Antioch, Alexandrian, Western, and Eastern. And the Eastern was, at first, for the majority of folks, they thought that it was really a combination of the Antioch and the either the Western or the Alexandrian, kind of a mixture. But now, as they study it more, they seem to think that some of that's present, but also the Eastern kind of has some of their own characteristics that are not like the others. All that sounds complicated, right? And it sounds like, my gosh, there's that much of a mixture of things. But what we have to understand is, even when we're talking about this mixture, they all agree like 98-99% of the time. So even though the differences on most of them is going to be how many words, a lot of times the older, which is the Antiochian, is also the Byzantine. They're the newer manuscript evidence that we have. They're dated, much earlier. I mean, much sooner, much more recently, I guess I should say, than the other ones. The other ones, like the Alexandrian, is thought pretty much to contain some of the oldest. Going back to the 200s into right around 300 AD and so forth. So, when you compare them, you can kind of see that as time went on, and in certain areas, that the copyists, the scribes, for either liturgical purposes, which would be, for purposes of using them in the church and so forth, would kind of polish up some things. If they're looking at, the difference in the Gospels, telling the same story, a lot of times they would try to make them more identical than maybe what they were in the original. Again, the important thing to remember is, even in all those changes, doctrine was not affected. I know that the argument from the King James only side is that the new translations corrupt doctrine, like the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, and these sort of things. When we get to the specific text comparison, verses and so forth, we'll be able to look at those more specifically. But let me say on the outset, let me say right now, that all of the textual critics that study these manuscripts and compare them and categorize them and all that kind of stuff, they will tell you that the Orthodox Christian doctrines are maintained in all of them. So it's not like there were some that were just so far corrupted that they're not even Christian anymore. And seeing that's not the claim that comes from the King James only things. So that's kind of the evidence I'm having to pull out, because if this sort of information is all that you've received, that's what you're thinking. And so now I'm having to, since I say that I'm not King James only, and I'm saying that the evidence persuades me not to be King James only, then I'm having to work extra hard to overcome some of the misrepresentations and so forth on the King James only side, to show why I'm not persuaded by those arguments. And that's one of the arguments. There's not a denial of these doctrines and so forth. Anyway, I'm at about 7 minutes now in this video. So I just wanted to show that there's actually 4 categories of text. This is what he says. I'll just real quick, since the focus on all the King James only material is going to be the Alexandrian text versus the Antiochian. This is what Bruce Metzger says about the Alexandrian text. Is usually considered to be the best text and most faithful in preserving the original. Characteristics of the Alexandrian text are brevity and austerity. That is, it is generally shorter than the text of the other forms, and it does not exhibit the degree of grammatical and stylistic polishing that is characteristic of the Antiochian type text. Until recently, the 2 chief witnesses to the Alexandrian text were the Codex Vaticanus, I know you're going to hear about that a lot, and Codex Sinaiticus. You're going to hear, you hear about them too, in the King James only material. They date from about the middle of the 4th century, which is, the middle of the 300s. With the acquisition, however, of the Bodmer Papyri, particularly P66 and P75, both copied about the end of the 2nd or the beginning of the 3rd century, evidence is now available that the Alexandrian type of text goes back to an archetype that must be dated early in the 2nd century. The Sahidic and Bohairic versions frequently contain typically Alexandrian readings. Then he goes on to talk about the Western texts, which can be found in Italy, Gaul, North Africa, including Egypt. And it was used by Marcion, who was a heretic, Tatian, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Cyprian. Those are all church fathers. Its presence in Egypt is shown by the testimony of P38 and P48. Anyway, in Codex Bezae, Codex Claromontanus, Codex Washingtonianus, Old Latin versions, African, Italian, Hispanic forms of Old Latin text. The chief characteristic of Western readings is fondness for paraphrase. Words, clauses, and even whole sentences are freely changed, omitted, or inserted. Sometimes the motive appears to have been harmonization, while at other times it was the enrichment of the narrative by the inclusion of traditional or apocryphal material. Some readings involve quite trivial alterations for which no special reason can be assigned.